The first sensation was light, not the radiant blaze of a star, nor the soft illumination of a cathedral lumen, but a violent, searing rupture, warp light with the taste of eternity buried inside it. It tore through the Emperor's senses in a single unbroken flash, and for a moment, even he, the master of mankind, felt disoriented. Time folded like molten metal around him, bending under the weight of an impossible return. The last memory he possessed was his broken body collapsing upon the golden throne, humanity's future hanging by a thread as the galaxy screamed in fire and betrayal. Then, silence. And now, the throne room was gone. He stood instead in the cool dusk of terror long before its doom, the air thick with incense and the faint hum of ancient machinery suspended in stillness. The walls were unscarred, untainted by the millennia of suffering that would one day seep into every stone. This chamber, this moment, belonged to the age before the heresy, before the War Master's fall, before the galaxy split itself open in grief. He knew it instantly. Knowledge burned through him like a second heartbeat. The warp did not lie. Reality had not lied. He was here. For the first time in 10,000 years, he breathed without pain. The impossible truth pressed against his mind with the weight of an entire species. He had been cast backward, not as a vision, not as a fragmented echo, but in full. His presence here was real, physical, undeniable. The warp had never given gifts without poison, and the Emperor knew this phenomenon must carry a purpose, a cruel one. Yet purpose did not matter. The moment he sensed the subtle shift of time, the faint stir of psychers across Terra responding to his sudden reappearance, he understood what this meant. He had been granted a chance to correct the greatest tragedy of mankind, a chance to face his sons before destiny shattered them. But time was not a placid ocean. It was a living serpent, coiling and shifting under his steps. Already he felt resistance, faint but present, as if the immaterial realm remembered what should have been and recoiled at what now was. The Emperor straightened, allowing his golden aura to dim until it flickered like a dying ember, just enough to avoid alerting the entire Imperial palace. His re-entry into this moment must be controlled, quiet, deliberate. Footsteps echoed from the outer corridor, measured, armored, unmistakable. Custodians. Their minds brushed against his like sparks striking a forge, their psychic signatures aflame with recognition and confusion. They had sensed him, of course they had. His arrival had shaken the warp around Terra like a thunderclap. He stepped forward before they could attack or kneel, his voice steady and resonant with command. Enter. The doors parted. 2 custodian wardens stood framed beneath the archway, halberds lowered slightly. Their faces bore the calm discipline of warriors made to guard a god, but their eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. To them, the Emperor had not left this era. To them, he had never died. And yet something in him, something in the tension that clung to his presence, felt wrong. Father of the Imperium, one began, bowing his head, but not fully lowering his guard. There was a disturbance. There was, the Emperor answered, and nothing more. Even a single misplaced word could fracture the fragile balance of this moment. He moved past them without explanation, each step a reminder of the gravity twisting around him. He needed solitude. He needed insight. And above all, he needed to ensure that no one, not custodians, not primarchs, not even Malcador, could yet perceive what had occurred. As he walked deeper into the palace, psychers trembled faintly in the distance. Servitors paused mid-task. The sigils etched into the marble walls whispered with dormant power, as if sensing something ancient, something returning that should not be here. The Emperor ignored them. His destination lay ahead, behind a sealed obsidian gate bound in wards older than most civilizations. The Hall of Convergence. This chamber had once served as a place of silent meditation, its air purified, its walls layered with protections against warp intrusion. It was a sanctuary of contemplation known only to the Emperor and the Sigillite. No one else would intrude here. It was the one place where he could face the truth without eyes upon him. He entered, sealing the gate behind him. The chamber embraced him with stillness. Here, the warp thinned, revealing its faint tremors like ripples across black water. He extended his consciousness, searching through every layer of reality, peeling back the veil until the truth trembled before him. The timeline resisted his presence. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Memories of the future, his future, quivered like reflections disturbed by unseen hands. The warp recoiled, confused by an emperor who existed in 2 points of history simultaneously. He felt the weight of both lifetimes pressing upon him. The father who mourned his sons, and the father who had not yet lost them. The paradox would not remain dormant for long. He could feel another truth coiling in the darkness, ancient and venomous. The ruinous powers had felt his return. They sensed the fracture in fate, and they would not remain idle. Fate was already bending, reshaping itself in response to this intrusion. Chaos would not permit him to rewrite destiny unchallenged. He could hear their whispers, faint, mocking, hungry. A cold tide rolled through the chamber. Time itself shuddered, and in that shudder, he sensed the first ripple of the future shifting, an echo of something wrong, something altered, something approaching with the inevitability of a falling star. The Emperor opened his eyes. Someone, somewhere, had already reacted to his return, and the first thread of fate had begun to unravel. The silence within the Hall of Convergence thickened until it felt nearly alive, as though the chamber itself strained to comprehend the paradox standing at its center. The Emperor remained motionless. His consciousness extended far beyond the mortal senses of the body he now inhabited. What he felt was not merely a shift, but a deep tectonic lurch within the fabric of fate. Someone had perceived the disturbance his return created, and that awareness moved like a distant tremor through the warp, subtle, yet unmistakably deliberate. It was not the blind, instinctive agitation of demons. It was thought, recognition, calculation. He closed his eyes, allowing the warp's currents to unfurl around him like smoke drawn into a slow vortex. The timeline had become layered, 2 futures overlapping in quiet conflict, and within the shifting currents, he sensed the consequences of his presence spreading outward. The custodians who had seen him would now feel an unease they could not name. Malcador, with senses sharpened by centuries at his side, would not remain ignorant for long, and beyond terror, the more psychically attuned Primarchs, Magnus most of all, would feel the tremor like a distant thunder rolling across the horizon of their minds. The Emperor withdrew his presence slightly, binding his vast aura within tighter confines. To let it flare would risk revealing everything before he was prepared to confront it. Time's wound must remain hidden until he understood its depth. But even with his restraint, the warp continued to stir, responding to the tension between what had happened and what must not. This was not a simple return. It was a collision of truths. He stepped toward the center of the chamber, placing his hand upon the obsidian table carved from a fragment of pre-imperial meteorite. Its cold surface hummed faintly with wards, he had personally etched into existence. They recognized him, responding with soft pulses of light, acknowledging both the Emperor who was and the Emperor who should not be here. Through the stone, he sought clarity, drawing strands of time into focus. Images surged before him, fractured, incomplete, but heavy with meaning. Terra's skyline unbroken by siege, the palace unscarred, the Primarchs scattered across the galaxy, each unaware of the shadow that would one day consume them. And then, layered atop these visions, the future he remembered. A crippled Imperium drowning in its own devotion, demons feasting upon unending war, his sons lost to corruption, madness, or death. The contrast was a blade pressing against the throat of destiny. He knew the truth that lay at the heart of this paradox. To speak openly of what would come could fracture the loyalty of his sons before the seeds of betrayal had even been planted. Horus, proud and burdened, would not accept warnings that defied reason. Magnus would question, probe, dig for answers within the warp until chaos took notice. Even the loyal sons, Guilliman, Dawn, Sanguinius, might struggle to reconcile their father's divinity with his fear of the future. And yet silence was equally perilous. If he allowed events to unfold without intervention, the galaxy would again descend into the same ruin. The thought of Sanguinius falling, of Terra drenched in blood, of himself bound eternally to the golden throne, clawed at the edges of his resolve. A faint ripple disturbed his thoughts. Not warp echo, not memory, footsteps, soft but purposeful. They halted beyond the sealed gate, just outside the chamber's wards. Even muffled, he recognized the cadence. Malcador the Sigillite, the one mortal who could approach without fear, whose mind carried knowledge deep enough to sense the disturbance long before others. The Sigillite did not attempt to enter. He merely stood in silence, waiting. Malcador understood what few others ever did, that the Emperor would speak when he chose, not when prompted. The Emperor exhaled softly, letting the visions fade. He approached the gate, opening it with a thought. Malcador bowed his head, though his eyes remained sharp with unspoken questions. The warp residue clinging to the Emperor was impossible to ignore. Something extraordinary had occurred, and the Sigillite's ancient instincts warned him that the universe had subtly shifted. There was a rupture, Malcador said quietly. His voice carried the weight of centuries. It spread across Terra like the aftershock of a dying star. The Emperor regarded him in silence. Malcador had always possessed the clarity to perceive truths without needing them explained. But this truth was too vast, too dangerous to reveal openly. Not yet. A disturbance, the Emperor replied, mirroring his earlier words to the custodians. Its nature is complex. Malcador's gaze dipped briefly to the floor, a sign of contemplation. The warp is restless. Something pushes against the edges of reality, as if two currents struggle for dominance. He hesitated, then added, "It feels like a memory displaced from its rightful place." The Emperor felt a rare flicker of tension coil through his thoughts. Malcador was perilously close to the truth, too close. "You must trust," the Emperor said, and the weight of his tone silenced any further inquiry. Malcador bowed deeply, accepting the command, though not the answer. Before the Sigillite could speak again, a sudden flare erupted through the warp, sharp, bright, unmistakable. A psychic presence probed reality with the force of a blazing sun. Magnus, the Primarch's mind swept across the immaterium like a crimson storm, drawn by the paradox of his father's altered essence. The Emperor turned his gaze skyward. Magnus had felt him. And in the depths of that psychic flare, another answered. Something ancient, something hungry. Chaos had found the crack in the timeline, and it would not remain silent. The psychic flare that erupted from Magnus did not fade. It swelled, stretching across the immaterium like a burning veil. It pulsed with questions, confusion, and an urgency born from instincts too refined to ignore. Magnus had not merely sensed the Emperor. He had sensed the fracture, the wedge of paradox driven into the roots of reality. The Emperor felt the Primarch's searching presence scraping along the warp, probing, reaching, demanding to understand what could shake his father's essence. And beneath that searching light, shadows stirred in reply. Chaos answered first. A whisper slid through the warp, silent yet venomous, brushing against Magnus before recoiling like a predator startled by a larger beast. The Emperor felt it clearly, a demonic awareness, ancient and patient, circling the anomaly. It did not yet understand what had changed, but it felt the distortion. It tasted the potential to twist it. Already the warp's currents thickened, as though clogged by threads not meant to coexist. Time resisted the paradox of his return, and chaos moved to exploit that resistance. Malcador felt the tremor as well, though dimly, his mortal senses catching only the echo of a storm too vast for flesh. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the unease that gnawed at him. Magnus presses harder than before. Something has disturbed his equilibrium. He feels change, the Emperor replied, walking past him. And he is not the only one. He stepped into the corridor, his presence dimmed but controlled, his mind reaching outward with precision sharpened by millennia of mastery. In the distant warp, Magnus pushed again, his psychic aura roiling with desperation. The Emperor did not answer him, not yet. Any direct response might trigger the Primarch's insatiable curiosity into a frantic search that would draw the attention of powers he could not allow to intervene prematurely. Terror itself responded subtly to the Emperor's altered state. Within the Imperial Palace, astropaths shuddered, clutching at temples as they felt the tremor-like pressure behind their eyes. Choirs whispered of a disturbance they could not name. Even the custodians along the perimeter shifted uneasily, their gene-forged instincts sensing a dissonance in the golden presence they had sworn to guard. The palace felt the beginning of a fracture it could not yet understand. The Emperor reached a balcony overlooking the wide expanse of the inner palace. The air carried the scent of cold stone and incense, but something else lingered, an electric tension, like the stillness before a storm breaks. Below, the sprawling labyrinth of marble corridors and towering statues stretched in pristine order, untouched by the scars of the future siege he remembered too vividly. For a fleeting moment, he stood between two realities, one unmarred, the other drowning in ruin. He closed his eyes, extending his consciousness with the precision of a blade. He followed the tremor back to its source. Magnus blazed in the warp like a radiant star, a mind sculpted for sorcery, for vision, for truth. Magnus was not searching blindly. He was following a thread, one tied directly to the Emperor, and that thread, newly woven, had already begun to pull others with it. A custodian approached from the far side of the balcony, his expression tight with barely concealed tension. "My lord," he said, lowering himself in a half-bow. Reports from the astropathic choir confirm a spike of disturbance across multiple channels. They believe an external force has pressed upon the great beacon. "I am aware," the Emperor answered. The custodian hesitated, his discipline warring with concern. Is this your doing? The Emperor turned his gaze upon him. The custodian's breath caught, though he showed no fear. Warriors of his order did not fear their god, but they could sense when something within him had changed. The Emperor allowed only a fraction of his truth to surface, just enough to steady the warrior's thoughts. "What you sense is a momentary imbalance," he said softly. "One that will be corrected." The custodian bowed deeply and withdrew, the tension in his steps easing. But the Emperor knew the truth was not so simple. The imbalance was not momentary. It was growing. The warp shifted again. A second psychic presence joined Magnus, sharper, colder, like a blade drawn across icy stone. Not a Primarch, not a demon. A mortal psyker of remarkable strength, stationed somewhere on Terra, reacting with fear at whatever he had sensed. His panic radiated through the Imperium, sending ripples outward. Threads frayed at the edges, warping under the strain of competing futures. The Emperor concentrated, restructuring his aura, folding every stray echo of his displaced existence inward. He had to minimize his contradiction. He had to reduce the wound his presence inflicted upon time. But even as he did so, he felt something undeniable, a new fissure forming, subtle but real, branching from the original crack. The future he remembered had already begun to diverge. The first change, small, nearly invisible, had settled into the world like a seed waiting to grow. Magnus flared again, and this time the warp pulsed in response. A distant metallic clang echoed through the Imperium as though a chain had snapped. The Emperor's eyes narrowed. Magnus was nearing something he must not reach. Not yet. If he pushed too far, if he glimpsed even a shard of the paradox, chaos would descend upon him with a precision born of millennia of manipulation. The Emperor withdrew his consciousness. The time had come to act. The first ripple had become a wave, and he could no longer permit the warp to unravel unchecked. He turned away from the balcony, his steps slow but unyielding. Magnus sought answers. Chaos hunted opportunity. And somewhere in the shifting currents of fate, a single decision waited, one that would either seal the timeline's fractures or tear them wide open. Magnus's psychic aura grew sharper with every passing heartbeat, a blazing, crimson vortex spiraling through the warp as he pressed harder against the veil that concealed the Emperor's altered essence. His mind was too powerful, too attuned to the unseen currents to ignore the distortion. In Prospero's vaulted sanctums, where wards shimmered like stained glass woven from light, a tremor ran through every rune-etched surface. The Thousand Suns halted mid-incantation, their voices faltering as a ripple of unease passed over them. Somewhere deep within the pyramid of Photep, Magnus stood motionless, a towering silhouette of flame-touched gold, his single eye narrowed with growing alarm. He did not yet understand what he had sensed, but he knew it was centered on Terra, and he knew it was connected to the Emperor. The Emperor felt Magnus's will, distant yet unyielding, brushing against the warp currents around Terra, like the probing fingers of a scholar deciphering forbidden scripture. If Magnus continued pushing, he would see too much. The Emperor withdrew his presence further still, compressing his aura until the immaterium around him dimmed like a star shrouded by shadow. But Magnus was relentless. His nature had always been relentless, seeking truth even when truth burned. The Emperor moved deeper into the palace, the echo of his steps a measured cadence along corridors lined with statues of forgotten heroes. Each figure seemed to watch him with eyes carved from cold stone, as though aware of the subtle divergence unfolding within their timeless hall. He walked with purpose, yet carried a tension that no mortal could have discerned, a tension born from the shifting threads of destiny, each vibrating with the threat of calamity. The sigillite followed a measured distance behind. Malcador did not speak, but his expression carried the weight of growing suspicion. He felt the disturbance tightening around them like a tightening noose, and though he could not perceive the true magnitude, his instincts whispered that the galaxy stood at the edge of some unknown turning. The Emperor halted near a vast mural depicting the Great Crusade, his legions marching in disciplined formation beneath banners of victory. Countless worlds had fallen to his purpose, yet among the triumphs painted across the marble, he saw ghosts of a future not yet written, broken suns, shattered worlds, the ruin that awaited all. He rested a hand upon the cold surface, feeling time shiver around him. Magnus pushed again. This time the intrusion was sharper, more forceful, slicing through the warp with a psychic brightness that made lesser minds cry out in pain. Across Terra, dozens of astropaths collapsed, overwhelmed by the intensity of the flare. Choirs faltered mid-chant. The wards protecting the Imperial Palace flickered like lanterns caught in a sudden storm. The Emperor inhaled slowly, tasting the shifting currents of the warp as a captain tastes the wind before a tempest. Then he felt it, a shadow twisting behind Magnus's searching presence. It was faint at first, a whisper, a curl of frost along the edges of thought, like the cold breath of a creature lurking within an unseen cavern. But its intent was unmistakable. Chaos had noticed Magnus's probing, had sensed in his desperation an opportunity to corrupt. The Emperor saw the shadow unfurl like a tangle of roots beneath a forest floor, sliding toward Magnus's awareness with patient hunger. The Emperor's aura flared, not outward, but inward, coiling around itself like a locked gauntlet. The shadow recoiled slightly, confused by the sudden shift, but it did not retreat fully. It waited. Malcador stepped closer, sensing something ripple through the air, though unable to perceive its cause. "Magnus," he said in a low voice, "he searches for you." "He must not see what lies beyond," the Emperor replied. The words were soft, yet they carried the weight of an unbreakable command. "What has changed?" Malcador asked, more quietly than before. "Your presence carries dissonance. Even the warp recoils. This is no mere fluctuation. What happened within the Hall of Convergence?" The Emperor did not answer. The truth would shatter the fragile lattice of events holding the timeline together. Instead, he turned away, letting his silence be the only response Malcador received. The sigillite bowed his head, not in obedience, but in acceptance of the burden he was not yet permitted to share. The Emperor extended his consciousness once more, no longer searching, but observing. Magnus's psychic form burned brighter, fueled by both fear and determination. The Primarch's heartbeat thundered through the warp, an echo of desperation, of longing for answers. Magnus had always sensed the Emperor's emotions in ways the others could not, and now he sensed something that terrified him: change. Magnus whispered into the Imperium, his voice a tremor of psychic flame. "Father, what has happened to you?" The Emperor felt the question pierce through the layers of reality, as though Magnus had spoken directly beside him. The question vibrated with pain, suspicion, and a flicker of dread. For Magnus, the Emperor had always been immutable, an unchanging beacon of absolute certainty. But what Magnus sensed now was contradiction, fractured divinity, a shift in resonance as subtle as the cracking of a star. The Emperor answered only through the warp's faintest ripple, a signal too weak to reveal detail but strong enough to steady the Primarch's spiraling thoughts. It was a whisper of reassurance, a command for patience. But the shadow behind Magnus heard it too. It stirred. A tendril of warp rot slid along Magnus's aura, testing him, measuring him, savouring his confusion as though scenting weakness in a wounded beast. Magnus stiffened, instinctively reinforcing his psychic defences. But the shadow did not attack him. It merely withdrew, as though having tasted enough to know it could return later, stronger, hungrier, and with purpose. The Emperor straightened, sensing the echo of a decision forming within Magnus. The Primarch would not be deterred. He would seek answers not through chaos, but through contact, through proximity. Magnus was preparing to reach out directly. Across the warp, a crimson flare ignited, bright enough to momentarily blind lesser psychers. It was a signal, a vow, a declaration of intent. Magnus had decided to come to Terra, and with that choice, the first great divergence in the tapestry of fate began to sharpen its edge, ready to carve a new path through the heart of the Imperium. The Emperor felt Magnus's decision settle into the warp like a falling blade. The Primarch's intent radiated outward, raw, determined, undeniable. He would come to Terra. He would seek answers directly from the source, no matter what veil obscured the truth. And that singular resolve pulled at the threads of destiny with dangerous weight, drawing the attention of forces that should have remained dormant. The Emperor withdrew his extended consciousness, sealing his aura within himself until it became a fortress of golden silence. He could not allow Magnus to read any further, nor could he risk chaos sinking its talons into the newly forming fracture. Magnus's arrival had to be managed, controlled, prepared for. He turned from the mural and walked deeper into the palace, the air cool and heavy with incense rising from distant braziers. Malcador followed, his footsteps quiet, precise, carrying the tension of a man who understood enough to fear the rest. The Emperor's course was deliberate. He descended through the inner corridors until the walls shifted from ornate marble to the darker, sigil-etched stone of the restricted sanctums. The doors that barred the way opened without touch or command, responding instinctively to his presence. The final seal parted, revealing the chamber reserved for only the most guarded councils, a circular room whose walls absorbed sound, whose wards shielded even the faintest whisper from warp or mortal ear. Malcador stepped inside after him, folding his hands within the sleeves of his ancient robes. His eyes traced the Emperor's movements with controlled unease. "If Magnus comes to Terra unbidden," he said quietly, "the legions will take notice. Consider the political weight, the War Master, the Council. Even the Mechanicum watches his movements closely." The Emperor knew. Every Primarch's step carried consequence, but Magnus most of all. His arrival would stir whispers of forbidden knowledge, of unsanctioned sorcery, of instability within the ranks of the legions. And yet, denying the Primarch audience would only deepen the fracture already forming. "We cannot allow panic," Malcador continued, "nor suspicion. The Imperium is too young for fractures of command. If Horus interprets Magnus's sudden arrival as a challenge, their rivalry may sharpen into something worse." The Emperor paused at the center of the room. The mention of Horus carried the faint taste of grief across his thoughts, a shadow of a future he had already lived, one where Horus fell, where betrayal tore the galaxy open. Here, that tragic destiny still lay dormant, a seed unsprouted. But the timeline's distortion shifted everything. Even the smallest change could ignite a spark. He spoke calmly, but his words carried a heaviness that Malkador felt like a chill. The events to come must be guided with precision. Each step taken in haste invites disaster. Malkador lowered his head. "Then speak, my lord. What has changed?" The Emperor looked upon his oldest, most loyal companion. Malkador, though mortal, had walked beside him through centuries of shadow and fire. He had been the architect of countless secrets, the keeper of every burden no one else could carry. Yet even he could not withstand the full truth of the paradox. The consequences of knowing would warp his actions, fracture his resolve, and in doing so, widen the timeline's wound. "There are truths," the Emperor said slowly, "that even you cannot hear. Not yet." Malkador's face tightened, not in defiance but in pain. Trust was not his weakness. Obedience was his strength. But both were strained beneath the weight of the Emperor's silence. He bowed deeply. "Then tell me only what I must do." The Emperor turned his gaze to the darkened ceiling where wards shimmered faintly like constellations. "Summon the hidden council." Malkador's breath caught. "All of them?" "Their insight will be required." The hidden council was not a mere advisory circle. It was a shadowed assembly of individuals, scholars, psychers, strategists, and silent watchers, bound by oaths older than the crusade itself. Only the Emperor and Malkador knew them fully. Only they knew how often the Imperium's future depended on those who worked unseen. Malkador inclined his head. "They will come." The Emperor stepped toward a pedestal of black stone rising from the center of the chamber. Upon it rested a single sealed codex, blank to all eyes except his. He placed his hand upon the cover, and the pages unfolded like petals awakening to sunlight. They bore no ink, no script, yet meaning hummed through them like the resonance of a deep chord. It was not a record of history. It was a map of fate, one he had crafted long ago to guide the Imperium's path. But now the line shifted. Entire sequences flickered, becoming unstable. War zones that once stood fixed began to drift. Primarch fates blurred. Horus's name pulsed faintly, as though vibrating between two destinies. Malkador watched, unblinking, though the codex revealed nothing to him. "It is worse than you implied." The Emperor did not deny it. He traced a hand over a section of the codex where the future should have been certain. The path where Magnus would attempt his desperate warning. The path where Horus would fall. The path where the Emperor would be bound eternally to the throne. Those threads flickered in and out, unstable, as though unsure which future remained true. "Magnus's decision to come here has accelerated the divergence," the Emperor said. "He senses change, but he does not understand its cause nor its danger." "And Horus?" Malkador asked. "Horus still stands untouched by corruption," the Emperor replied, though the words tasted like cold iron. "But the shadow that once ensnared him now moves earlier. It searches differently. It tests the edges of fate." Malkador exhaled slowly. "If it senses Magnus's upheaval, it will look elsewhere," the Emperor finished. "It will seek a new path, a new weakness." A hush fell between them. For the first time since his return, the Emperor allowed the faintest flicker of concern to cross his thoughts. Not fear, not doubt, but recognition of the monumental balance he now walked. Every action he took to prevent the future risked creating another path just as dark. The Emperor closed the codex with a soft whisper and turned toward the chamber's entrance. When Magnus arrives, he must be guided, not restrained, not frightened, guided. Yet he must not learn the truth, Malkador murmured, not until the moment demands it. The warp trembled again in the distance. Magnus preparing for departure, his psychic storm coiling around him like a shroud. But beneath that brilliance, something else moved, another presence, watching, waiting, testing the new shape of fate. The Emperor felt it clearly. Chaos had begun its first deliberate move, and the council that would face the storm was about to gather. The chamber's wards dimmed as the Emperor stepped away from the codex, its pages sealing shut with a whisper that echoed through the sanctum, like the exhalation of some ancient creature. The oppressive quiet that followed was not silence but anticipation, time itself holding its breath. Outside the chamber walls, the warp trembled with currents, both subtle and malignant. What had begun as a faint distortion in the tapestry of fate was now deepening into a widening fissure. The Emperor felt the shift as surely as a warrior feels the tightening of an enemy's noose. Chaos had sensed the divergence. Its movements were no longer instinctive reactions but deliberate tests, precise, probing, coordinated. What once lurked in the shadows of events now prowled openly between the seams of possibility, seeking weakness in the altered strands of destiny. Malcador stepped forward, his lined face illumined by the muted glow of the sanctum's wards. "The council will gather within the hour," he said quietly. Those who watch from the silent places already moved toward Terra. The Emperor nodded, though his attention had shifted far beyond the room, far beyond Terra itself. He extended his awareness through the warp with measured caution, his presence woven tightly to avoid the raw flare that had drawn Magnus's alarm. He skimmed through the layers of immaterium like a blade gliding across frozen water, seeing without being seen. At first, the warp appeared its usual tumultuous chaos, roiling with madness and hunger. But beneath its constant turbulence, something else pulsed. A rhythm, a pattern, a whispering synchrony. Chaos was listening. He felt tendrils of warp consciousness stretch outward. Not toward Magnus this time, but toward innumerable mortal minds scattered across the Imperium. Weak psychers, astropaths, unshielded souls drifting like sparks in a freezing wind. The whispers coiled around them, probing their thoughts, testing their fears, seeking cracks through which corruption might grow. For Chaos, time was irrelevant. A single frightened mind could serve as the foundation for a catastrophe centuries later. The Emperor's gaze hardened. "What has changed in the warp?" Malcador asked, sensing the shift though unable to follow its threads. "The powers grow curious," the Emperor replied. "They sense movement in their prey, a change they do not yet comprehend. They believe Magnus is the source. For now." Malcador exhaled with subtle relief. "Then Magnus draws their attention away from Terra." "For now," the Emperor repeated. But he knew this reprieve was fragile. Chaos had not survived eons of war by clinging to assumptions. Already the whispers probed deeper, trying to discern what had twisted the Emperor's aura, what had unsettled the warp so violently that its storms recoiled in confusion. His return was a wound in reality, and the ruinous powers were closing in like predators drawn by the scent of blood. Beyond Terra, deep within the warp-laced expanse between stars, the 1,000 suns prepared for their Primarch's departure. Magnus stood alone in the center of an arcane chamber, his eye closed, his aura blazing with restrained urgency. Runes orbited him in molten patterns, bending to his will. His thoughts churned with questions that burned like coals pressed to the mind. Something was wrong with his father, something fundamental. He could not yet name it, but the uncertainty gnawed at him like hunger. Yet in his determination, a subtle shift had begun, one so slight it might have gone unnoticed by any other being. Magnus's confidence, once absolute in his father's invulnerability, had developed a single fault line. A possibility had entered his thoughts, fragile but dangerous, that even the Emperor could change. And chaos, lurking beyond comprehension, savoured that fracture with slow delight. The Emperor withdrew his awareness from Prospero before Magnus could sense his presence. He returned fully to the sanctum, though the warp's distant whispers still coiled around his thoughts. Malcador watched him carefully, sensing the weight he carried. "We must act before Magnus arrives," Malcador said. "If chaos moves early—" "They already have," the Emperor interrupted. Malcador froze. "Where?" The Emperor did not respond immediately. His gaze drifted toward the far reaches of the sanctum, where shadows clung to the walls like living things. He felt the tremor of distant minds cracking under the pressure of warp whispers, felt subtle shifts in probability as tiny events altered their trajectories. A navigator hesitating before entering the void. A captain questioning orders he once obeyed without pause. A choir master faltering in his devotion. Small fractures, insignificant in isolation, yet together forming roots of corruption that could one day bloom into catastrophe. But the deepest disturbance was closer. "Somewhere within the palace," the Emperor said at last, his voice as still as the void, "a mind has been touched." Malcador stiffened. "Impossible. The wards are strong," the Emperor finished, "but not unbreakable when fate itself bends." Malcador's hands tightened within his sleeves. "Who?" "A lesser psyker, newly recruited to the astropathic ranks." His gaze lowered, not in sorrow, but in grim certainty. Chaos used the moment of Magnus's flare to slip through his fear. Malcador's expression darkened. What was whispered? "Only doubt," the Emperor answered. "But doubt is a seed that grows swiftly when nurtured by shadows." The Emperor moved toward the exit of the sanctum, his steps deliberate, the air trembling faintly with the controlled power held within him. Malcador followed in silence, understanding that the path ahead was narrowing with every heartbeat. The timeline no longer balanced on the original fulcrum of Horus's future betrayal. The fracture had shifted, widening in places it never had before. The future was becoming fluid, no longer anchored to the tragedy the Emperor remembered. Chaos recognized it too, and that made the game infinitely more dangerous. As the Emperor approached the threshold of the chamber, he felt the warp stir again, this time not with curiosity, but with intent, a subtle strategic movement. Chaos was not merely watching, it was choosing its next strike. The Emperor stepped into the dim corridor beyond, his gaze fixed forward. The palace hummed with unease. Magnus's psychic storm grew brighter in the distance, preparing for departure. The touched astropath whispered to himself in a dark corner of the palace, unseen by any but the powers that now coiled around his thoughts. The seeds of treachery had been planted, and even the Emperor could not yet see where their roots would spread. The Emperor walked through the dim corridor beyond the sanctum. His aura wound tightly around him like folded wings. The unsettling tremor in the warp deepened with every step, a steady pulse that hinted at the widening fracture he could not yet seal. Somewhere within the palace, the touched astropath whispered to shadows only he could hear, his murmurs soft yet heavy with consequence. Magnus prepared for departure. Malcador summoned the hidden council, and now another presence stirred at the edge of awareness, one the Emperor had been avoiding until the moment demanded confrontation. Horus. The War Master's psychic resonance brushed against the distant warp with the steadiness of a disciplined mind. a bright flame shielded by iron will. He was far across the stars, commanding the lunar wolves in a campaign that should have been flawless in its execution. Yet the Emperor felt something subtle threading through the War Master's essence, a tug, faint but unmistakable, like a whisper brushing against the surface of calm water. The same forces testing Magnus had turned their gaze elsewhere, sensing opportunity in the one whose destiny had shaped the galaxy's future ruin. The Emperor paused at a tall, narrow window overlooking the inner courtyard of the palace. The night sky was clear, the stars bright, and below them, the banners of Terra's legions fluttered in the still air. This was the age before despair, before betrayal, before tragedy carved itself into every stone. And yet the weight of those futures lingered around him, the memories as vivid as wounds that refused to close. His thoughts reached outward, carrying the faintest whisper toward the lunar wolves. He touched the warp gently, careful not to distort its currents further. He found Horus in the heart of a command deck, tall, resolute, surrounded by the hum of engines and the disciplined presence of captains awaiting orders. His aura was steady, but there was tension buried beneath the surface, as though a stray doubt brushed him in fleeting moments he had not yet acknowledged. Horus lifted his head suddenly, sensing something. His gaze turned toward a distant point on the command deck wall, unseeing, yet searching. "Father," Horus whispered, though no one heard him. "Is that you?" The Emperor withdrew instantly, severing the link before Horus could follow it. Any prolonged contact might reveal the paradox, and Horus, attuned to the Emperor's presence more than any other son, could unravel the distortion without attempting to. Still, a faint echo of warmth lingered within him, a reassurance the War Master interpreted as his father's silent approval. For now, that was enough to steady him. The Emperor allowed it. Horus deserved stability. He needed clarity, discipline, and unshaken loyalty, especially in a galaxy poised to fracture. But chaos had not overlooked him. Far beyond the lunar wolves' fleet, a ripple moved through the warp, slow, deliberate, a predator's glide beneath black waters. This movement differed from the faint whispers touching weaker psychers. It was deliberate influence drawn toward the largest, brightest flame on the field. Chaos recognized Horus's importance, and in the altered timeline, it sought new avenues of corruption. Though it did not yet comprehend the Emperor's return or the changes rippling through fate, it sensed opportunity. The Emperor felt the warp's attention slide along Horus's edges as if tasting him. Malkador approached from behind, bowing his head. "My lord, the hidden council gathers." The Emperor did not turn immediately. His eyes lingered on the stars, stars that in another future would burn with war unending. "Horus must not feel the disturbance in its entirety," he said. "His path must remain steady." Malkador's voice was quiet. "If the War Master senses anything unusual, the other Primarchs will feel it as well. Your silence alone may create imbalance. The truth would create worse." Malkador hesitated, then spoke with the caution of a man approaching a precipice. "You have always guided him more closely than the others. If he senses you withdrawing, he may take it as mistrust." The Emperor closed his eyes briefly. He remembered the moment, in another timeline, when mistrust became a spark, when independence became isolation, when love curdled into doubt. Horus had been his most trusted son, the one he had raised with both pride and burden, and that bond, once strained, had created the greatest tragedy humanity had ever endured. "He must feel neither distance nor dependence," the Emperor murmured. "Only certainty." But certainty in what, my lord? That the path ahead is not yet written. Malcador remained silent, sensing that the Emperor's words carried a deeper meaning than he would reveal. The Sigillite stepped aside as the Emperor began moving toward the inner sanctum where the council awaited. Yet before he reached the chamber, the warp shuddered again, this time with a force that made Malcador inhale sharply. Magnus had taken to the Imperium. The Primarch's psychic flare ignited across the warp in a blaze of crimson that illuminated entire regions of the immaterial realm. His mind surged with urgency, threading through currents of sorcery and prophecy as he propelled himself toward Terra. But behind him, the shadow that had brushed his aura earlier began to stir once more. It followed him with new interest, its movements sharpened by the changes in destiny. The Emperor felt the shift clearly. The shadow had recognized something Magnus himself had not. Fear. Not fear of chaos, not fear of betrayal, fear of the Emperor. A crack formed not by doubt in loyalty, but by the realization that his father had changed in some unknowable way. That fear was enough to draw corruption. The Emperor quickened his pace, his steps echoing with growing urgency. He entered the vast chamber where the hidden council sat, their faces half lit by warded fire, their minds shielded against outside influence. As they rose to greet him, he lifted a hand, commanding silence. "A great divergence has begun," the Emperor said, his voice filling the chamber with the weight of fate. Magnus draws near. Chaos moves against him. Horus feels the first tremors of a future rewritten. Every action now determines the shape of the Imperium's soul. He stepped into the center of the chamber, golden light dimming to a cold glow. We must prepare. The next moment will determine everything. Even the air seemed to tighten around him. For beyond the warp's veil, Magnus hurtled toward Terra, and chaos followed close behind. The chamber fell into a deep, resonant silence as the Emperor's final words settled over the hidden council. Each member understood the gravity of the moment, yet none grasped its full depth. Only the Emperor could sense how sharply the threads of destiny twisted, how the warp began to fold and reshape itself in response to the coming convergence. Magnus cut through the Imperium like a falling comet, brilliant and urgent. Chaos followed. Horus hesitated light years away, a single doubt forming in the void of his otherwise disciplined mind. And deep within Terra, the touched astropath whispered trembling fragments of fear that seeped as faint ripples into the palace's foundations. The Emperor felt every movement, every tremor, every breath shifting the balance further. The future was no longer a straight line. It was a field of fractures. He turned from the council without a dismissal. His presence alone was command enough, and moved through the palace corridors with growing urgency. Malcador kept pace, though even he struggled to mask the strain etched across his features. The warp flickered again, like lightning behind storm clouds, and the Emperor felt the first divergence manifest materially. Far across the Imperium, orders began to shift. The lunar wolves, guided by the faint echo of reassurance the Emperor had unintentionally left within Horus, altered their preparations for the next engagement. Instead of striking swiftly as planned, Horus delayed deployment by an hour. An insignificant change, yet one that realigned the movements of several supporting fleets. That ripple extended further still, affecting the positioning of Imperial Army battalions waiting under his command. Commanders who should have advanced hesitated. Others who should have held position advanced early, sensing a subtle change in the War Master's cadence. On Macraga, Gilliman felt the tremor ripple through the strategic substratum of the Imperium. His mind, ever attuned to order and structure, registered the shift with quiet unease. He sensed no danger, no clear anomaly, only a dissonance in the rhythm of decisions across Legion commands. He paused mid-discussion with his praetors, his expression tightening as he studied the shifting patterns across hololithic charts. He did not know its cause, but he felt the Imperium reposition itself, as though guided by unseen gravity. In distant nocturne, Vulcan turned his gaze skyward, sensing a subtle tension threading through the warp. His connection to the Immaterium was not sorceress like Magnus's, but instinctive, forged through fire and trial. He felt pressure building, a distant heat like a forge drawn too tight. He murmured a prayer for his brothers, unaware that the timeline twisted around them in slow, deliberate spirals. Even Rogel Dawn aboard the Phalanx paused as his ship's auger systems registered a faint warp fluctuation. His stoic nature dismissed it at first, mere background radiation of cosmic phenomena. But something in the pattern unsettled him. A tightening, a shift in the Emperor's distant resonance, a subtle hum that did not match 10 millennia of unwavering presence he had known since the day he first opened his eyes on Inwit. All these ripples arose from a single truth. The Emperor was no longer the same point of certainty. His presence, altered by the paradox, left a shadow in the warp that bled into the minds of his sons and the strategic instincts of the Imperium at large. They sensed the change not consciously, but through instinct honed by their creation. And their reactions, small, almost invisible, were already bending the courses of fleets and legions. Magnus sensed these subtle shifts even as he hurtled through the warp, arriving at their edges before understanding their cause. His mind flared in alarm. He felt the uneasy motions of the legions like a discordant hum in a once stable symphony. Fleets moved too soon or too late. Commands contradicted each other. Stratagems realigned without apparent reason. He paused mid-flight, hovering in the Immaterium, his aura blazing against the rising dark. "Father, what have you done?" he whispered into the void. There was no answer, but chaos heard him. The shadow that followed him lengthened, coiling more tightly as it tasted his growing uncertainty. It whispered, not in words, but in impressions, questions, doubts, secrets half-formed. It nudged the edges of Magnus's mind, encouraging him to look deeper, to probe more sharply, to seek truth beyond what the Emperor had shown. And the moment Magnus attempted to push further, the warp screamed back at him with a shock of cold resistance. The Emperor felt that scream. He halted in the corridor, one hand bracing against a carved pillar as the Immaterium convulsed. Malkador turned sharply, alarm flaring. "What is it?" "Chaos tests Magnus," the Emperor answered, "and he pushes back." He straightened, tightening his aura further until it collapsed into a near-invisible knot of raw force. He could not reach Magnus without widening the paradox. He could not pull him back without manipulating the threads too directly. All he could do was guide the path indirectly, through the subtle shaping of events around Terra. But even as the Emperor refocused, orders continued shifting across the Imperium. A regiment on Armatura loaded ammunition earlier than scheduled. A Mechanicum Forge temple paused a critical production cycle without understanding why. A rogue trader adjusted her warp route by a fractional degree after a dream she could not recall. These small changes, born from the Imperium's sensing tension in its sovereign, cascaded outward like the first sparks of a wildfire. Malkador studied the Emperor's stillness, dread blooming behind his calm expression. If these shifts continue, my lord, even loyal commanders will begin to question the stability they rely upon. Confusion breeds disorder, and disorder invites chaos, the Emperor finished. He moved again, faster this time, his steps carrying him toward the chamber of Astronomicon, where the light of humanity's beacon pulsed like a star captured in crystal. He needed to reinforce its stability before Magnus's arrival. If the beacon faltered even slightly, the Primarch would interpret it as a sign of weakness, of change, of betrayal. Magnus's psychic aura flared behind him, nearing terror's edges. Chaos's shadow sharpened, its hunger made bold by the widening fractures. The legions moved without understanding why, shifting their positions in a galaxy preparing for a storm none yet perceived. And the Emperor walked into the heart of the palace, where the fate of the next moment hung suspended, like a blade awaiting its fall. The Astronomicon chamber throbbed with psychic brilliance, its immense crystal heart pulsing like a captured star struggling against its cage. The Emperor entered in silence, his presence dimmed yet unyielding, the warp twisting faintly around him, as if uncertain whether to bow or recoil. Choirs of psychers knelt in concentric circles, their faces pale and strained, sweat beading along their temples as they channeled humanity's collective hope into that singular, blinding beacon. They felt his arrival only as a ripple, lighter than a breath, yet unmistakable. It steadied them, if only for a moment, but beneath their focus, beneath the raw, burning glow of the beacon itself, something simmered in the immaterium, a pressure, a contradiction. Two futures pressed against one another. The Astronomicon flickered. Only once, only for a heartbeat, but the Emperor felt it as keenly as a blade sliding between ribs. Malcador felt it as well, his breath catching sharply beside him. That was not instability, the Sigillite whispered. That was interference. The Emperor said nothing. He stepped toward the beacon's crystalline core, his aura tightening until it formed a shield of golden gravity that pressed into the warp like a stabilizing anchor. The light surged in response, smoothing, settling, as if recognizing him, yet uncertain of what he had become. The paradox that clung to his essence hummed faintly, invisible to the mortal eye, yet bright as a wound to the warp. The choir steadied, the beacon brightened, but the Emperor's gaze narrowed. He sensed the distortion running through the Astronomicon. Not an attack, but an echo. Two versions of its future resonance battled beneath its surface, one stable, one fractured. The Imperium of his past fought for dominance against the Imperium of this altered timeline. Neither truth yielded. The galaxy trembled around that conflict. Across the void, Magnus felt the flicker. It passed through him like a shockwave of cold fire, halting his momentum as he tore through warp currents toward terror. His eye widened, panic lancing through him. The Astronomicon had always been perfect, steady, absolute. The Emperor's will made manifest. Its flicker was a scream in the void. Father. His voice cracked, swallowed by the warp. He accelerated, crimson aura blazing brighter, but the warp itself recoiled from him. It twisted, curling back, not in fear but in confusion, uncertain which version of the beacon to answer, which truth to obey. Magnus pressed harder, his determination sharpening to desperation. Yet behind him, the shadow lengthened further. Chaos tasted the dissonance within the Astronomicon, the split between two destinies. To the ruinous powers, it was intoxicating, a wound in time that bled possibility. They reached toward the fracture with talons of thought, not directly, but through the closest vulnerable mind entwined in it. Horus. Far across the galaxy, aboard the vengeful spirit, the War Master stiffened as a cold tremor passed through him. His eyes lifted from the star charts before him, his jaw tightening. For just a fragment of a moment, he sensed something. A whisper, a shiver through the bond he held with his father. Not corruption, not temptation. Something stranger. Something like contradiction. His captains noticed the brief pause. "War Master," one ventured. Horus blinked once, recovering the steadiness that made entire armies follow him without question. "A momentary warp disturbance," he said. "Nothing more." But his words carried an unspoken lie. He knew something had shifted. The connection he shared with the Emperor, a connection forged deeper than loyalty and older than the crusade itself, quivered with dissonance. A note out of key. The galaxy, in turn, responded. In the void between stars, warp storms flared and died in patterns that made no sense. Some weakened prematurely, others rose like snarling beasts. Navigators reported visions of palaces that stood in ruin, and palaces still untouched by war, overlaying one another like reflections on shattered glass. A fleet near Korth stalled as its lead navigator collapsed, screaming about two lights, one dying, before his third eye sealed itself shut. On distant Kondax, White Scar's warriors paused mid-ritual as they felt the warp's currents twist against the grain of fate. Even the Mechanicum on Mars felt the dissonance, machine psychers bowing their heads as binary psalms faltered. The galaxy sensed two futures struggling for dominance. Within the Astronomicon chamber, the Emperor felt each of these tremors as pressure against his thoughts. Magnus's psychic trace approached Terra like a comet ablaze, becoming clearer, stronger, impossible to ignore. Yet behind him, the shadow that chased him had grown far bolder. The Emperor could feel it now, no longer merely testing the edges of Magnus's mind, but weaving threads of subtle manipulation through the currents behind him. A parasite lurking in the Primarch's wake. Malkador sensed none of this directly, but he felt the Emperor tighten his aura further. "Magnus approaches too quickly," he murmured. "If the warp is in disarray—" "It is more than disarray," the Emperor replied. His voice was even, but the chamber shivered at its underlying force. "The Immaterium perceives two destinies. It cannot reconcile them." Malkador swallowed, his composure straining. If Magnus arrives while fate is still fractured, he will see what he must not, the Emperor finished. The crystal pillar of the Astronomicon flared as he stepped closer, laying his hand against its surface. Light roared within it, turbulence hammered into stillness by his will. For a moment, the beacon shone with perfect crystalline clarity. The choir gasped softly, steadied by its brilliance. But beneath that calm, the fracture still pulsed, invisible to all but him. He withdrew his hand. Every heartbeat now carried weight. Magnus thundered through the warp, terror rising before him like a golden flame. Chaos followed him, its hunger sharpening with every second. The legions across the galaxy felt the shifting of the Emperor's unseen rhythm, and at the center of it all, two truths fought to become the one that would define the Imperium's future. The Emperor turned from the Astronomicon. The moment of convergence was no longer approaching. It was already here. The Astronomicon's brilliance still echoed faintly through the Emperor's senses as he left the chamber, but its light could no longer hide the truth stirring within the warp. The fracture did not close. It pulsed, widening with every heartbeat, as if reality itself struggled to root out the paradox clinging to his existence. Magnus's psychic trail grew sharper, so bright it cut through the Immaterium like a burning wound. Chaos followed him in a patient coil of darkness, its movements no longer cautious but deliberate. And deep within terror, the touched astropath's murmurs spilled into the warp, like droplets of ink bleeding through silk, subtle yet staining. The Emperor walked swiftly through the palace's upper corridors, Malcador close behind, their steps echoing like distant thunder. Custodians stationed along the walls straightened unconsciously as he passed, though none dared speak. They felt something amiss. His presence carried a tension they had never known, a resonance unaligned with the perfect certainty they had always sensed in him. Malcador broke the silence first, his voice low yet heavy with concern. Magnus is too close. The warp storms distort around him. If he pushes further, he risks drawing the shadow outright. He already has, the Emperor answered. The shadow clings to him because he feels fear. Malcador halted, his robe brushing the marble floor. Fear, Magnus? A crack, not of loyalty, the Emperor replied, but of understanding. He believes I have changed. Thus Chaos believes there is weakness. They resumed walking, the corridor narrowing toward the inner lifts that led to the strategium, the nerve center of Terra's defense, and the chamber closest to the Emperor's private scrying wards. As they descended, the warp pulsed again through the immaterium. This time, the pressure struck like a blow. Not a whisper, not a test, a surge. Magnus pushed his power outward, seeking clarity, and Chaos pushed back. The Emperor felt Magnus's aura flare violently, then fragment as the shadow pressed deeper into the warp around him. It did not touch the Primarch directly, not yet, but it manipulated the currents, spinning illusions of shifting corridors, phantom warnings, distant roars. It attempted to isolate him, confuse him, break him from within. In response, Magnus's mind hardened, blazing with defiance. His determination tangled with desperation, his thoughts reaching for Terra with frantic urgency. Father, something hunts me. What have you concealed? His psychic voice trembled with accusation, fear, and loyalty twisted by confusion. The Emperor's jaw tightened, but he did not respond through the warp. Any direct answer risked widening the fracture. He could only prepare. The lift doors opened into the strategium, its vast dome enclosing 1,000 shifting hololithic displays. Maps of stars glittered like constellations trapped beneath glass. Data slates whispered with endless streams of logistics. Strategists bowed as the Emperor entered, their minds flickering with awe and unease. The distortion in the warp had already reached them. A faint dread thrummed beneath their thoughts, a dread they could not name. The Emperor stepped to the central dais and activated the scrying sphere. Golden light curled upward, shaping itself into a shimmering lattice of warp flow across the galaxy. Magnus's trail blazed crimson. The shadow pursuing him spread like ink across water. Malcador approached, brow furrowed as he studied the lattice. It grows bold. Whatever hunts him has adapted to the paradox. It has recognized opportunity. Malcador's eyes darkened. Does it understand that you have returned changed? No, the Emperor answered. It does not know how. It only knows that something is wrong. The sphere flickered, destabilizing as a sudden warp flare erupted from Magnus's position. The Emperor extended his hand, stabilizing the image with a thought. Magnus's psychic form convulsed within the storm. The shadow thickened. And then, something new emerged. A whisper, not to Magnus, but beyond him. Directed elsewhere. Directed toward Horus. The Emperor stiffened. Malcador felt the shift like a temperature drop. What is it? Malcador asked, voice taut. The Emperor's gaze sharpened, his expression carved from iron. Chaos moves, not toward Magnus, alone. It reaches for Horus. It tests the fracture from two sides. The sigillite paled. If Horus feels what Magnus feels, then the War Master will perceive contradiction where none should exist. Malcador's breath trembled. It could unbalance him. It could break him. Across the stars, bored the vengeful spirit, Horus gripped the edge of the tactical table. He felt the whisper again, not a voice, not a thought, but a pressure brushing against his mind like a cold fingertip. He growled softly, forcing himself to stand tall as his captains observed. But inside, a single doubt spread through him like frost. The Emperor's presence was changed. Magnus's panic vibrated through the warp. Something hunted his brothers, and Horus felt alone. The Emperor sensed every tremor of his son's uncertainty. The pain of it struck him with the weight of remembrance, for he had already lived the consequences of Horus's doubt. The galaxy's ruin had blossomed from a seed of confusion. He could not allow that pattern to repeat. Not again. The warp convulsed. Magnus broke through the final storm veil surrounding Terra. Chaos snapped at his heels. The Emperor moved from the dais with sudden urgency. Prepare the wards. Magnus arrives within moments. Malcador followed, his robes whispering behind him like restless shadows. Can we shield him from the truth? We must. If he sees the paradox now, he will tear it open, searching for answers. And the shadow. The Emperor's eyes hardened, luminous with restrained power. It will follow him through the warp, but it cannot breach the palace if I stand ready. They reached the final corridor leading to the summit of echoes, the chamber where Magnus would appear. The air crackled, the warp howled, reality bent, and with a sound like a star imploding, Magnus's psychic presence struck Terra's edge. The Emperor inhaled once, steady and cold. The shadow did not break. It came with him. Magnus struck the threshold of Terra like a falling meteor. The warp peeled away from him in violent shreds, reality bending under the impact of his psychic arrival. For a heartbeat, he stood suspended between realms, his form blazing with crimson fire, his single eye wide with desperate purpose. Then the summit of echoes swallowed him in a surge of materialization, runes igniting across the chamber walls as they struggled to contain the force of his entry. Air displaced in a thunderous shockwave. Incense braziers guttered, wards flickered, and the Emperor felt the shadow enter with him. He stepped forward before the echo faded, his presence descending upon the chamber like a golden storm front. Light gathered around him, quiet yet absolute, forcing the warp's residue to retreat. Magnus staggered once, steadying himself against the marble stair. His breath came sharp, his aura frayed, and the crimson flame surrounding him trembled with agitation. Behind that flame, behind his force of will, the Emperor saw the fracture, fear, doubt, strain. A son wounded not by enemy blade but by uncertainty. "Father," Magnus whispered, his voice a mixture of awe and alarm. "Something follows. Something clings to the path behind me." "I know." The Emperor's voice was calm, but the air around him tightened. "You must hold your mind still." Magnus tried, but the shadow had already recognized its opportunity. It slid along the edges of the chamber like a smear of oil across water, invisible yet heavy. Its presence a distortion, a thinning of reality. Terra's wards resisted it, but the paradox opened a gap, small, flickering, enough for chaos to press its essence through like a needle slipping between plates of armor. Magnus flinched as his mind brushed the intrusion again. "It hunts me. It knows. Something has changed. Something in you, Father. Malkador moved swiftly to the outer circle of runes, his staff pressed to the ground as he invoked the hidden wards. Light flared upward, creating a lattice of psychic containment. But even reinforced, the wards quivered. The shadow pressed against them silently, not striking, testing. The Emperor lifted his hand. Reality stilled. The shadow froze, caught in a moment held taut by sheer force of will. Magnus felt the pressure of the Emperor's containment like a storm collapsing around him. The air thickened until it felt as though existence itself strained to hold its shape. "What you sense is not change," the Emperor said softly. "It is distortion, a wound in time." Magnus's eye widened, his breath hitched. "Then it is true. You are different." The Emperor stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "I am what I must be." Magnus's aura cracked. "Why will you not speak plainly? The warp trembles around you. The Astronomicon flickers. My brothers shift in their commands without reason. And now this thing pursues me. Because of something you have done. Because of something you are." The Emperor felt the weight of those words sink like iron into the air. Behind Magnus's confusion lay devotion. But devotion frayed by uncertainty became peril. A Primarch's instability could shake the Imperium. A sorcerer, Primarch's instability could shatter it. "Magnus," the Emperor said, "not as a god, not as a sovereign, but as a father. You must trust me." Magnus's jaw tightened. "I always have. But trust does not blind me. The warp shows fractures where none should exist. Your presence echoes twice across the immaterium. Tell me why." A mortal would have broken under the weight of that moment. Even Malkador closed his eyes, knowing how fragile the next words would be, how easily truth could destroy what silence barely held together. The Emperor did not answer directly. Instead, he placed his hand upon Magnus's brow. In that instant, a wall rose within Magnus's mind, not shutting him out, but shielding him. A barrier of golden light, silent and absolute, severing the Primarch from the shadow's influence. The pressure surrounding the chamber cracked, the shadow writhing as if struck. Magnus gasped at the contact, the warmth of the Emperor's power sweeping through him like a tidal wave. But he sensed something else beneath it, a sorrow he had never before felt in his father, a weight, a grief that did not belong to this era. "Father," he breathed, the realization scraping at him. "What happened to you?" The Emperor withdrew his hand slowly. "Another truth," he said, "one not meant for this moment." "But it hunts me," Magnus insisted, fear sharpening his voice. "It hunts us, because something between you and the future has broken." "It hunts because chaos seizes any crack it finds," the Emperor replied, "even those that did not exist until now." The shadow convulsed again, pressing hard against the runes that held it suspended. Malkador braced himself as the lattice trembled. "My lord," he said, voice strained, "the wards will not hold forever. We must dispel it." "No," the Emperor replied, "we must detach it." Magnus's eye flicked toward him, confused. "Detach?" The Emperor moved to the center of the chamber, his aura descending like a mantle of stars. "This shadow has anchored itself to you through fear, through uncertainty. It is not a piece of chaos alone. It is a response to divergence. If we strike it, we strengthen the fracture. If we resist it, we widen it. We must sever its reason to cling." Magnus swallowed hard. "And that reason is me." The Emperor turned to him. "The reason is your doubt." A tremor ran through the chamber as those words struck Magnus deeper than any blow. His breath caught. Doubt was the one thing he had fought against all his life. Doubt in humanity, doubt in his gift, doubt in the Imperium. And now it was the knife chaos used against him. He lowered his head. Then tell me what I must believe. Before the Emperor could reply, the shadow lunged, not physically, but psychically, striking the wards with sudden force, sensing the weakness, tasting Magnus's moment of fear. The runes flickered violently. Malcador staggered, his staff slamming into the floor. Magnus flared with crimson light, instinctively raising his defenses. The Emperor extended his hand, golden brilliance erupting forward. The chamber shook, the shadow screamed, and in that collision of light and darkness, the fracture widened just enough for fate to shift again. The golden throne, vast and silent deep within the palace, shuddered. A sound like cracking stone echoed through chambers untouched for centuries. Reality had felt the wound, and it would not heal easily. The tremor that shuddered through the golden throne reverberated across the palace, like a distant cry caught beneath the stonework of eternity. Though faint, it carried a message no mortal could hear, a warning, a shift, an echo of strain. The Emperor felt it immediately. The throne had reacted not to an attack, but to contradiction. Two futures struggled at its foundation, and the paradox of his return had finally reached its buried heart. If left unresolved, the fracture would not simply distort the present, it would unravel the very mechanism that anchored humanity's survival. The shadow struck the wards again, but weaker now, wounded by the Emperor's golden flare. Its form twisted in agitation, folding in and out of coherence as if torn between retreat and persistence. Magnus staggered back from the aftershock, crimson flames flickering violently around him. His hand pressed to his brow, the weight of the Emperor's truth, unspoken yet undeniable, pressing against his mind with unbearable force. "What is happening?" Magnus whispered. "I felt it, the throne." It cried out. Malcador steadied the runes once more, though his hands trembled despite a lifetime of composure. The throne reacts to warp disturbances only when they reach catastrophic thresholds. This fracture, whatever its nature, touches its foundation. Magnus turned his gaze to the Emperor, desperation bleeding through his aura. "Father, whatever you have concealed, whatever has changed, reality itself strains beneath it. The warp hounds me because it senses something broken. And now the throne trembles. Why? What have you carried alone?" The Emperor did not answer immediately. His silence was not avoidance, but calculation, measuring the cost of truth. For a mortal, knowledge was burden. For a Primarch, knowledge was destiny. And for Magnus, whose very soul was woven with the warp, knowledge could become disaster, but withholding truth had grown equally dangerous. The shadow pressed again, not violently this time, but with a patient, probing persistence. It sensed indecision. It sensed Magnus's unraveling certainty. Its hunger sharpened like a hook waiting to set. The Emperor raised his hand slightly, and the chamber stilled. Even the warp light flickering behind the runes dimmed for a moment, as if the immaterium braced itself. "Magnus," he said quietly, "your doubt is the thread to which this shadow clings. I cannot banish it while the question remains unanswered." Magnus's breath caught. "Then answer it." The Emperor stepped closer, his presence surrounding the Primarch, not with divine dominance, but with the gravity of truth. "I am not as your other sons perceive me. I am not even as you have known me. My presence is fractured because I have lived what should never have been lived." Magnus's eye widened. The warp around him responded with a heavy shudder, rippling with raw anticipation. "I have seen a future," the Emperor continued. "A future in which the Imperium falls into ruin. a future where betrayal erupts from the heart of loyalty, a future where I am bound eternally to the throne in a state between life and death, unable to guide humanity as I should. Magnus's voice broke before he could form the words. Father, how? I existed in that future, the Emperor said, and now I exist here before it begins. Two truths cannot coexist without tearing at one another. Magnus felt the weight of those words strike through his entire being. A father who had lived his own death. A God-wrought sovereign carrying memories of millennia of suffering that had not yet happened. And Magnus, ever the seeker of truth, felt his heart fracture under the revelation. You came back, he whispered. You broke time. I was brought back, the Emperor corrected, not by choice, by necessity. Magnus's aura faltered. But if you have changed the past, then fate is unbound, the Emperor finished. Every choice now births new dangers. Magnus staggered backward as the shadows surged eagerly, feeding on the swell of realization. Malkador braced the wards, sweat trickling down his temple despite the cold air. But why tell me? Magnus whispered. Why reveal this truth now? Because without belief, the Emperor said, you will break, and the shadow will claim you. Before Magnus could respond, the shadow struck with a sudden, violent intensity. The runes crackled, their golden lattice bowing inward as the warp bled through the seams of reality. It lunged directly at Magnus now, sensing the wound in his heart, the fracture of his certainty. The Emperor extended both hands. Golden brilliance erupted, filling the chamber with a radiance so fierce it forced Magnus to shield his eye. The shadow shrieked, a sound that echoed not through air but through thought. It writhed as the Emperor's light poured into it, unraveling its form strand by strand. But as it weakened, it clung more desperately to Magnus, its tendrils reaching for the fear that still lingered within him. Magnus struggled to breathe. Father, I cannot. You can, the Emperor said, but only if you believe. Magnus closed his eye, forcing his mind into stillness. Amid the storm of revelation and terror, he reached inward, past doubt, past fear, into the place where his devotion to the Emperor had always resided. The bond forged not from obedience, but from purpose. His breath steadied. The crimson flames around him brightened into a steady blaze. The shadow recoiled. It could no longer anchor itself. The Emperor seized the moment. His golden brilliance intensified, collapsing inward like a star forming under impossible pressure. With a final, resonant surge, he struck the shadow, not to destroy it, but to sever its chain. The chamber shuddered. The shadow screamed into nothingness. The runes dimmed. Magnus fell to one knee, gasping as the last remnants of the intrusion faded from his aura. The Emperor lowered his hands slowly, the brilliance diminishing into a controlled glow. The shadow is gone, Malkador whispered, exhausted. For now. Magnus looked up at the Emperor, tears of shame, awe, and fear trembling in his voice. What must I do? The Emperor's expression was solemn. You must stand with me, without question, without doubt. For the future I have seen must not be allowed to return. Magnus bowed his head, accepting the weight of fate. The Emperor turned away. But as he did, he felt the golden throne tremble once more, deep, distant, unavoidable. The fracturing had only begun. Across the void, Horus paced the command deck of the vengeful spirit, his thoughts uneasy despite the precise order he maintained around him. The subtle tremor that had brushed his mind earlier lingered like a cold shadow, a whisper of uncertainty that refused to fade. He could not name it, could not see its origin, Yet the discipline honed over countless campaigns was faltering under a weight he did not fully understand. The bonds he shared with his brothers, the rhythm of the legions, even the certainty of the Emperor's constancy, all strained as if reality itself had begun to bend beneath unseen hands. Meanwhile, Magnus had arrived upon Terra, his presence blazing with crimson fury, yet tempered now by the Emperor's intervention. The shadow that had pursued him, feeding on doubt and fear, had been severed by the radiant precision of golden light. Still, he could not shake the echo of the fracture in the warp, nor the sense that events had shifted in ways even the Emperor had not yet fully contained. He remained poised at the threshold of understanding, his psychic senses straining to perceive the threads of destiny now twisted around both himself and his father. The Emperor observed both from within the palace, his awareness stretching across the vast lattice of the Astronomicon and through the warp to touch Horus without touching, to steady Magnus without interference. Two war masters, one god-forged, one sun-forged, each bearing the weight of the Imperium's destiny in different ways, each shaped by loyalty, purpose, and the subtle tremors of time itself. Their minds danced in parallel, an intricate interplay of potential and consequence, unseen by the galaxy, yet pivotal to its survival. Horus's doubt, though slight, rippled outward, subtly influencing the movements of the lunar wolves and the supporting fleets. Orders misaligned, deployment patterns shifted, yet the commander's instincts held firm enough to prevent catastrophe. Still, he felt the weight of something unseen pressing against the precision he relied upon, a pull in the warp that suggested a presence not yet understood. It was familiar yet altered, resonant yet fractured. It was the Emperor, yet not the Emperor he had always known. And that subtle change, barely perceptible, carried the promise of chaos. Magnus's focus sharpened, honing in on the warp currents that connected the Imperium's heart to the Emperor and to the distant War Master. He perceived the tension, the subtle contradiction in the Emperor's aura, the echoes of two conflicting truths pressing against each other. The shadow had been severed, but the memory of its hunger remained, a warning of what could return if doubt was allowed to fester. Every psychic ripple, every minor deviation in reality, now had weight. Magnus understood that the consequences of miscalculation extended beyond mere battle. They could fracture loyalty, ignite suspicion, or empower the ruinous powers. The Emperor's voice resonated through the warp to Magnus alone, calm, absolute, directing without command. Hold steady. Neither of you may falter, for the fracture extends to them both. One misstep, and the Imperium's sons may turn against one another. Magnus bowed his head, absorbing the weight of the instruction. The crimson aura around him steadied into a controlled blaze, bright yet contained. Every pulse of his being now aligned with the Emperor's will, the bond of father and son reinforcing the lattice of destiny that the paradox threatened to unravel. Yet even as he drew himself into focus, the Emperor sensed Horus's unease spreading outward. The War Master's disciplined mind was a conduit for influence, and even a single ripple of doubt could cascade through the fleet, through the command chains, through the Primarchs themselves. Chaos sensed it too. The Immaterium shuddered, subtle tendrils probing the currents between Horus, Magnus, and the Emperor. It did not yet attack, but it measured, calculated, prepared to exploit even the smallest opening. The shadow had returned in essence, its shape altered, now patient, waiting for the precise moment when uncertainty could be pried open like a wound. The Emperor's vigilance contained it, but the strain of such constant attention left marks even upon his immeasurable will. The Imperium hung suspended between two possible outcomes, each capable of diverging catastrophically with the smallest misstep. Horus closed his eyes for a moment, attempting to reconcile the whispering uncertainty that tugged at his instincts. He felt the echo of the Emperor's altered presence, faint but undeniable, and instinctively raised a mental shield against the perceived intrusion. And in that instant, he felt a fragment of Magnus's clarity, a tether reaching through the warp to anchor him, to steady him. A son and a father, separated by distance yet linked by purpose and will, each unaware of the full extent of the other's perception, yet each influenced by the imperceptible pull of inevitability. The Emperor's gaze swept across the lattice of the Imperium in the Astronomicon, tracing every ripple, every alteration, every subtle divergence caused by the paradox. He measured Magnus's psychic balance, Horus's emerging doubt, and the shadow lurking at the edge, waiting. Every moment was critical. Every heartbeat carried weight beyond measure. The galaxy trembled in response to the alignment of these three forces: the god, the war master, and the son forged by will and destiny alike. And in that alignment, the first decisive choice approached. It would not be made by fleets, by orders, or by mortals. It would be made in the minds of two war masters and a father god, each struggling with the weight of impossible knowledge, each aware that the path chosen now would define the Imperium for 1,000 centuries to come. The warp hummed, the shadows stirred, and the galaxy waited. The warp convulsed like a living thing under siege, and the Emperor stood at its epicenter, his aura a golden anchor against the tide of entropy. Magnus flared beside him, the Primarch's crimson psychic fire tempered now by absolute focus, yet still quivering with the residual echoes of doubt and the shadow's earlier touch. Across the stars, Horus's disciplined mind strained to maintain coherence as he felt the faint tug of his father's altered presence and the imperceptible pull of Magnus's psychic tether. Two war masters, one father, one son, all caught in the storm of a universe bending beneath impossible divergence. The Emperor extended his awareness fully, threading it through the lattice of the Astronomicon, across the fleets of the Imperium, through the psychic currents of every Primarch, and into the Immaterium itself. The shadow that had dogged Magnus recoiled, sensing a force immeasurable yet precise, a presence that could collapse it without touching, could sever it without destruction. Chaos itself paused, its hunger halted by the impossible certainty of the Emperor's will. Every strand of the fracture, every alteration caused by his return, every ripple of uncertainty or fear was visible to him now, mapped in the warp like constellations traced in starlight. He inhaled, drawing the threads inward, compressing the divergence into a focal point of raw, disciplined power. The Emperor did not simply act. He wove. He wove reality, bending it with the weight of millennia, smoothing the fractures, disentangling contradictions, reconciling past and present in a single unbearable moment of divine concentration. Magnus's aura shone brighter, feeding into the pattern, stabilizing the lattice by the purity of his intent, his psychic fire intertwined with the Emperor's will. Horus, miles away, felt the subtle pull of coherence threading through him, a guide to correct instinct, a whisper of certainty in the storm. The shadow writhed, stretched thin, testing the limits of the Emperor's focus, but could not breach the discipline, could not resist the gravity of purpose. Its shriek, unvoiced yet heard in the deepest corners of the Immaterium, dissolved as strands of reality were rewoven. The distortion that had threatened the Astronomicon, the imperceptible tremor in fleets and legions, the flicker in Horus's mind, all aligned. Time bent, but it did not break. Destiny faltered, but it did not snap. Magnus gasped as the tension released, his psychic aura contracting in exhaustion, yet shining with steadiness he had not known in the chaos of arrival. The shadow's absence was absolute, leaving only the quiet echo of what might have been. He sank to one knee, trembling from the exertion of maintaining alignment with his father's unyielding will, and yet he understood that he had been indispensable. He had been a stabilizing force, a conduit, a bridge. Without him, the correction could not have taken hold. Horus inhaled sharply aboard the vengeful spirit. The tug on his mind vanished. Certainty returned like a long-lost rhythm. Orders that had begun to fracture reformed in exact precision. His fleet shifted into perfect alignment. Even minor fluctuations in the psychic resonance of the Emperor rippled through him as guidance, not intrusion, steering him subtly, a reminder of the bond he had never questioned and now understood anew. His chest tightened with relief, tempered by a lingering sense that the galaxy itself had changed in ways he could not yet see. The Emperor's presence receded from the outer reaches of the warp, folding inward upon itself with the delicacy of a star's death. He allowed the lattice of time to settle, the threads of causality vibrating briefly like plucked strings before coming to absolute rest. Terror exhaled, if only in perception, the psychic echo of relief washing through the palace. The Astronomicon shone with renewed brilliance, radiating stability through the Imperium. A beacon anchored not just by faith, but by the alignment of will, the unity of purpose, the careful stitching together of potential and choice. He turned to Magnus, whose head still bowed in reverent exhaustion. "It is done," the Emperor said. "The fracture is corrected. The shadow cannot return while your resolve holds." Magnus lifted his gaze, the fire of understanding and awe burning within him. "And Horus, does he know?" "Not yet," the Emperor replied, voice calm yet heavy. "He feels only the effect, the imperceptible guidance of certainty. The knowledge would destabilize him. One step at a time, my son. The future must remain intact until it can bear full revelation." Magnus nodded, the exhaustion in his form tempered by relief. "It is remarkable. You have rewritten destiny itself." The Emperor's gaze extended toward the Astronomicon, over the fleets, over the warp, over the imperceptible threads of time. Not rewritten, corrected. Destiny remains, but now it may endure without being torn apart before its appointed hour. The Imperium stands. He paused, feeling the hum of stability ripple through the lattice. Yet he did not allow complacency. He sensed the galaxy, quiet now, watching, waiting. The future was not guaranteed. It had been tempered, aligned, secured in this moment, but the choices yet to come would test it again. Magnus exhaled slowly. "And if it falters again, then we will stand, and we will correct it again," the Emperor said. "But for now, the Imperium breathes. The sons of the Emperor march, under the right stars." The shadow was gone. The warp was calm. The fleets were steady. And yet, even as the Emperor allowed himself a brief measure of satisfaction, he sensed the faintest ripple, distant and unreadable, brushing at the edge of reality, a whisper that not all consequences had yet revealed themselves. The weight of eternity pressed upon him. The correction was complete. But the cost would become known only in the moments yet to come. The warp settled like a glassy ocean under the weight of the Emperor's will, yet within its depths, ripples lingered, quiet and insistent, reminders that even absolute control bore consequences. Magnus knelt in the summit of echoes, his aura still smouldering with psychic exertion, yet steadied now under the Emperor's presence. The crimson flames of his power were contained, aligned to the lattice of reality that had been restored. He could feel it, faintly, the weight of every life preserved by the correction, every legion prevented from fracturing under misjudgment, every fleet guided with unseen precision. Relief, tempered with awe, radiated through him, but even he could sense that this moment bore a cost invisible to the eye. The Emperor turned away from Magnus, his gaze sweeping across Terra as if measuring the Imperium of souls beneath him. The throne, still intact yet subtly resonant with the echoes of the recent strain, hummed faintly, a vibration that spoke of effort and burden. He had corrected the timeline, steered the galaxy from divergence, severed the shadow from Magnus, and tempered Horus's perception. Yet even as the light returned to the Astronomicon, he felt the weight settle deeper, pressing into his mind and body like a tether anchored in eternity. Correction was not creation. Every act to preserve reality demanded that he carry its consequences alone. Malkador watched him closely, sensing the subtle gravity in his posture, the flicker of strain that the others could not perceive. "My lord," he said softly, "it is done. The Imperium stands as it should." The Emperor did not respond immediately. He allowed himself a moment to sense every ripple across Terra, across the fleets, across the psychic lattice that bound his sons and the Imperium together. Every thread returned to alignment, yet faint echoes lingered, shadows of moments that could no longer exist, yet had briefly touched reality. These echoes would fade with time, or perhaps remain hidden, waiting to be discovered by those attuned enough to perceive them. But the weight of them pressed upon him nonetheless. He turned his gaze to Magnus. The Imperium breathes, yes, but every correction carries a burden. The cost is unseen, yet absolute. You, even your brothers, cannot yet perceive it fully. Magnus struggled to comprehend the depth of those words. He had always understood sacrifice as a physical or psychic endurance. Yet this weight was cosmic, almost ineffable. "And you," he asked quietly, "what cost falls upon you?" The Emperor's eyes, infinite in their calm and depth, held the truth. "I bear it," he said simply. "Always have, always will. To intervene in destiny is to shoulder eternity's judgment. Every life preserved, every wrong avoided, every thread of fate aligned, they mark me, they shape me, they bind me." Magnus's mind flared with understanding and dread. He felt the immensity of the Emperor's presence not merely as a son to a father, but as a being stretched across time and reality itself. This was a god who had touched the strands of fate and paid the cost in ways no mortal or primarch could endure. Even his own suffering, even his own peril paled before it. Beyond Terra, the fleets moved with renewed precision, guided by invisible hands. Horus, unaware of the full depth of what had transpired, felt only clarity, certainty, and confidence restored. The shadow that had pursued Magnus was gone, leaving only the memory of its hunger, a lingering threat that could not yet act. Chaos recoiled, frustrated but patient, knowing that the war for souls never truly ended. The Emperor stepped toward the balcony overlooking the palace grounds. Terra lay silent under the night sky, the stars burning with an unbroken brilliance. Yet he knew that the future would always carry danger. The paradox corrected, the shadow removed, the timeline stabilized, but each intervention left a mark, a strain, a price that even he could not shed. He would stand vigilant, as always, a solitary sentinel against forces beyond comprehension, bearing the weight of billions and the eternity of the Imperium's fate. Magnus rose slowly beside him, his crimson aura now a steady burn of resolved power. "I understand now," he said, voice low, reverent. "Your burden. It is endless." The Emperor inclined his head, a faint acknowledgement, neither comforting nor apologetic. "Endless," he said, "and necessary. To act otherwise is to allow all that could be preserved to fall into ruin." The night stretched quietly over the palace, a fragile stillness restored. Yet beneath it, subtle currents continued to hum, a reminder that even corrected destinies could strain under scrutiny. Every life, every legion, every soul that the Imperium encompassed was bound to the choices made in this single moment, and the Emperor knew that one day the cost of all he had done would demand recognition, sacrifice, or both. But not today. He turned from the balcony, his presence folding inward, a god both eternal and tethered to the weight of what he had saved. Magnus watched, understanding in full now that intervention in the weave of reality required endurance beyond comprehension. Horus would continue as the war master, the legions would march as planned, and the Imperium would remain intact, for now. Yet in the quiet of the palace, the Emperor felt it in the very marrow of reality. The price of changing destiny was not victory, nor revelation, nor even the restoration of order. The price was the knowledge that some burden could never be relinquished. It would remain with him alone, bound to the threads of fate he had dared to touch. And so he bore it, as he always had, as he always would, the solitary guardian of all that humanity could hope to endure. The galaxy slept beneath a fragile dawn of certainty, unaware that its survival had demanded the immeasurable toll of a god. And the Emperor remained, eternal and unyielding, standing alone in the weight of destiny itself.